everyone, and thank you for logging in for this webinar today on the topic of fire management and vegetative fuel status. I'm Brian Bargenbrook in the Omaha office, and on behalf of the Central Plains Sioux community, I really appreciate you attending this. As you know, this is our effort to kind of bring research to operations a little bit more and bring in some subject matter experts from outside the National Weather Service to provide that expertise that we can use in our day-to-day operations. Early spring here, I know we've had a few fire events, even just in the past week or two. I think this is an important topic, and I hope that it's an enjoyable one for you all to get some new information, courtesy of Eric Chapman, who will be joining us today and presenting. Eric has been in the Wildland Fire Service for 28 years. He's got a degree in Rangeland Management and currently serves as the Assistant Fire Management Officer for Fuels at the High Plains District of the Bureau of Land Management in Casper, Wyoming. Eric is no stranger to fire and also the incorporation of weather into those operations. So I'm really looking forward to today's talk, looking forward to learning more, especially about fuel status and how our role as the National Weather Service plays into it, how we can help those folks in the fire weather community. But with that said, Eric, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, I appreciate that, Brian. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Yeah, I've been in the fire service since 1990, basically split between fire operations and hazardous fuels reduction. My career spanned engines, helicopters, and I'm currently reluctantly moving into some fire management positions. So along the way, I've gained a great passion for fuels and basically how fuels interacts overall into the fire behavior triangle. And today, my goals are basically to review the basic understanding of fuels, give a little bit of a kind of a refresher for you folks on the S190, S290, just so we can get on the same page. Talk about the various fuel models, go into how they're applied, and discuss how we get into the critical fuel status and the rationale behind it from a fire management perspective. So I apologize, I don't do these often. In fact, this is my first one, so you're going to have to bear with me on some of this. So hopefully everything goes smooth. Okay, so to start off, I think we need a basic definition of fuels. And what do we mean when we're talking about fuels? So in fire management lingo, when we say fuels, we mean we're dealing with the living and the dead organic matter, or basically anything that can ignite and burn in the resource management world. Today we're going to focus more specifically on fuel moistures and how past and present weather events can impact those fuels. So why should we care about fuels? Primarily as it affects fire behavior and the variations that we get in fuels and fuel moistures that can drive how a fire behaves. There's three areas that we'll focus on where fuels needs closer defined. Basically in the suppression world, prescribed fire world, and fire planning world. So these three distinct areas are really what we as fire managers are focusing all our time and efforts on, and how fuels plays a role in each. So in the suppression area, where we're primarily concerned with life and safety, the folks that we have out there on the line, and what kind of information can we get to them to build that situational awareness to give them that safety net. When we're talking prescribed fires, it's where we try and utilize fire in its natural role in the landscape to reach resource management objectives. And really, there's a lot of planning and effort that goes into this, and again, fuels plays a critical role. When we deal with fire planning, it's where specific fuel models impact staffing, funding, and other administrative functions, such as fire suppression. And this is a kind of an area where I view most of you meteorologists falling into, is when we're dealing with the NFDRS models and the outputs, and basically the calculations just give us that more climatic role or view of where and how fire plays its role. Okay, so it's important to understand the fire environment overall. In any specific fire discussion, the role fuels is playing in the overall scope. Basically, I tried to incorporate the basic cornerstone of fire behavior. You can see down there in the bottom right-hand corner when we're dealing with fire on the microscopic scale, we're dealing with oxygen, heat, fuel, obviously, gives us our fire. We move more into the fire behavior realm. We're dealing with topography, fuel, and weather, the basic fire triangle that we learned in S290. And then you could go even a little bit further with that and look at the fire regime area where climate, ignitions, and vegetation come to play. Well, you see there we've got vegetation and fuel playing that role that we're going to be talking about today, and hopefully I can nail down some of where we're coming from as a fire manager and looking at and how you folks can help us and we can help you build a better idea of where we need to look at the critical fuels environment. So this is where you folks come in. Again, fire managers utilize the products that you folks produce, not only to determine the current state of fuels in a given area, but to predict where they may be in the short-term, medium, and long-term periods. And when we're looking at fuels in the fire behavior triangle, we're basically looking over time and space where significant changes occur in both fuels and weather. That topography element, we're not seeing that so much, but does come into play as far as aspect, slope, things that we'll talk about here in just a bit. So essentially, folks like me continually bug folks like you about weather phenomenon we know just enough or less about to be dangerous, and to ultimately make an educated guess for predicting fire behavior on planning purposes. So my objectives again today are to define the live versus dead fuel moisture and how they're measured, differentiate terminology of differing fuel models and the specific purposes they're intended for, like the National Fire Danger Rating, or NFDRS. I'll refer to that as NFDRS from here on out. And fire behavior predictions. The differences between those are pretty critical. And if anything that you guys walk away with today is to understand where we're talking in these different fuel models or fuel types, you know, are we referring to National Fire Danger Rating System, or are we talking about fire behavior predictions? And finally, discuss how critical fuels are deemed critical. So the first question we need to ask is determining what fuels environment we're trying to capture data for. So you see I've got three elements there: suppression, prescribed fire, and planning. Under the suppression and prescribed fire role, we're really looking at short-term fire behavior prediction, dealing with an existing fire in a given time and space, and really it's site-specific. When we're looking at those, we're dealing pretty much on that mid-range scale in the fire behavior that I talked about earlier. And really that is the fire behavior end of it that we're looking at. When we jump over to the planning side, we're kind of looking at more of that administrative use of the fuel models. It's a broad scale look describing conditions that reflect fire potential, and we often use these in planning and fire business management. So the next question we need to look at is which fuels data are we trying to capture? There's a big difference that we have between live fuels and dead fuels. And frequently we're using either or using those together. So we take and measure the live fuels and the dead fuels at our local stations. We go out, we get our fuel samples, we get those weighed and measured, and we come out with the fuel moisture. Or we can utilize that through remote automated weather stations, RAW stations, or use those together to kind of correlate that data to make sure that things are driving okay. So I'm going to talk about specifically each one of these and how we get there with the fuel moistures. So some fuel modeling programs use either dead, live, or a combination of both in their fuel moisture measurements. When we're talking specifically about dead fuels, we're looking at how dead fuels, the diameter class, primarily. When we talk 1 hour dead fuels, which is our fine dead fuel moistures, we're talking about 0 to 1/4 inch in diameter. When we're looking at 10-hour dead fuels, we're looking at that 1/4 to 1 inch diameter. When we're looking at the 100-hour dead fuels, we're looking at the 1 to 3 inch diameter, and 1,000-hour fuels are 3 inches or greater. So that's kind of a good, refresher on the ones, tens, hundreds, and 1,000 hours that we look at. Frequently, you're going to see data products that focus on each one of those individually, and when that occurs, it's pretty important to understand that each one of them has their different size classes and the differences between. Often we use the pinky thumb wrist when we're talking with our folks on the line. That pinky is typically your 10-hour fuel model. The thumb is your 100-hour, or excuse me, the pinky is your 1 hour. The 10 is your thumb, and the 100-hour is your 3 inches or your 1 to 3 inch range. So what are we talking about when we're talking dead fuel moistures, dead branches, twigs, dead grasses, and forbs? We also look at the surface litter. That could be needle casts from trees or leaves. And duff and soil are also categorized as dead fuel moistures, or dead fuels, and we measure the moistures in those as well. So dead fuel moistures rarely fall below 3 to 4%. So as you know, this upcoming fire season, when you're looking at those fuel moistures, when you're looking at fuel moistures in that range, it's extremely low, and conditions are really ripe for increased fire behavior. We usually focus in on the 10-hour fuel moisture as our benchmark. This size class is what's typically used in the raw stations. They have a little 10-hour stick that's hanging off the side of the station and is measuring those fuel moistures. The 1s, 10s, 100, and 1,000-hour fuels are generally extrapolated up or down by adding, or subtracting 1% to the measured size class. So take, for example, you've got your 1-hour fuel moistures hanging around 5%. A lot of times when we want to refer to any fuel moistures from there on up, we just add that 1%. So the 10s would be at 6%, the 100 hours 7, and the 1,000 hours at 8+. Usually when you move into the 1,000-hour fuel moistures for that extrapolation process, they usually jump a couple of percentages. So you may end up in the 10 or 12, which are still extremely low and something of grave concern to the folks that are out there on the line. So fine dead fuels are generally considered the primary carrier to surface fire. We're not really looking at any other. Generally, we try to model these fires based on what we're seeing on the ground and how that fire moves through that vertical horizon. Fuel moisture content is really impacted strongly by precipitation events, evaporation, the morning dew, the fluctuations in that relative humidity. Fine dead fuels really are that short-term indicator that we see that's impacted dramatically by any of these kind of weather events. Again, fine dead fuel moisture fluctuates throughout the burn period. Weather events are the primary driver of where fuel moistures lay in any given period, and there's a lot of drivers that can influence that. Slope, aspect, shading, temperature, what month, what time of day seasonal, as well as relative humidity. All of these come into play to really dictate how that dead fuel moisture can either decrease in moisture or increase and greatly impact different models of that, or different sections of a fire and how that fire moves across the landscape. So again, a fire behavior is calculated based on ground fuels. Okay, moving into live fuels. Live fuel moistures consist of basically conifer needles, twigs, leaves, shrubs, anything that's alive and growing out there. The changes in the live fuel moisture content are related to the physiological activity of the vegetation, and this activity is greatly influenced by soil moisture and the soil and air temperature. We really take a good hard look at how that ground moisture is. You'll often see line personnel taking a boot or something and kicking up some dirt and just to see how well it clumps and if it shoots up in a big puff of powder. When the precipitation is deficient, less new growth is produced, and peak moisture in the living material can be less than during more moist years. And so there's an obvious and direct correlation between that soil moisture and the live fuel moisture. If the soil moisture deficiency persists throughout the summer, you can see the live fuel moisture drop more rapidly. I know the Keach-Byram Index, which you guys are more than familiar with, a lot of folks in the South and the Southeast, as well as all over the rest of the country, use that as a tool to correlate what we see in the locally collected live fuel samplings. We can take and look at the overall map and see if what we're pulling out of our live fuel moisture has correlation. And if it doesn't, we can be really suspect of how either where we collected those fuel samples or if that individual raw station maybe isn't, maybe caught that one rogue rain shower or whatever, but there's something there not jiving. So it causes us pause and we go back and double check that data. The most important thing to consider in live fuel moisture is seasonal changes. There's no question about that, because as live fuels are at their peak during the spring of the year in most regions, they are unavailable to burn. That doesn't contribute to the overall fire behavior. But as that progresses and those fuels dry out throughout the course of the summer, they become available. They become as much of a contributor as some of those dead fuels. That very easily seen in the fire seasons that we had up in the Northwest, as well as in the Northern Rockies region. So when they contribute to the overall fuel loading available to the fire, from a weather perspective, weather can contribute to the overall climate and probably plays a bigger factor to the live fuels. So that's really where, we're not looking at that short-term response that we see in the live fuels, or in the dead fuels, but really how it impacts and correlates to both. When they start coming together, we see that great increase in fire behavior. So the take-home message there is that live fuels are affected more by climatic or seasonal change, and dead fuel is more affected by the short-term weather events. So what I put here is a table of the breakpoints, the moisture breakpoints that are a rule of thumb for moisture content in live fuels, ranging from 300% down to 30%. 30% showing that completely cured, treated as dead fuel, which is pretty extreme. It's pretty rare that we see that, although I bet you we were pushing some of those live fuel moistures definitely in the fire season that we saw last year. When you're looking at that 300%, again, extremely high. You're talking right at the peak of spring, or the tail end of spring, where you're really pushing those leaves, and everything is in pretty much full turgor. A lot of times we take and extrapolate off that chart for geographically where things are a little bit different. What I put up here is another table which I pulled from Nevada and Utah, which they use as their moisture breakpoints, which are a little bit more reflective of the drier climate that they have, as well as where they're looking at fire behavior. You can see at that 180% and higher, they're really looking at that low fire behavior, which doesn't quite jive with that last sheet, but shows you that the range, there's a very large range, and you've got to geographically correlate that for where you're at. You can also see there at the 74%, we're well above what I had on the last sheet for 30% being where you're seeing that advanced fire behavior, where we can experience that at, between 75 and 80%. And that's actually typical for the area that we're in up here in the northeastern Wyoming. Around 125% live fuel moisture, we really start to experience an increase in that fire behavior tempo. And again, where we go back and have to really take a hard look at those fuel moistures and where they're ranging at for us. So when we collect those fuel moistures, there's the National Fuel Moisture Database, and you guys can see that web link there at the top of the picture there. Is a place that you can go, and it's a repository for the sampled live and dead fuel moistures. It's a great resource, and I highly recommend that you folks, if you get a chance, can take a peek in there. Typically, this time of year, we're not putting anything in, but as May, June, July rolls around here in Wyoming, we're definitely trying to get those fuel moistures put in. And the primary reason for that is just to look at the trending. And I'll allude to it later, but sometimes communication between fire managers and meteorologists isn't great. So any tools that you guys can use to kind of get an idea of where we're flipping and unflipping critical fuels, I think is a good idea. And this is an excellent resource. And again, a lot of times we can correlate this to an uptick in our fire behavior. Well, first of all, fire occurrence. As we start getting more fires, we start getting larger fires, and we start seeing that increase in fire behavior. Not a bad idea to jump back and check in the National Fuel Moisture Database region where we're at on how things have been reading. Basically our tea leaves. Okay, I'd like to jump into the fuels modeling application now, moving away from the live and dead fuels, pretty good recap there, and talk about fuel modeling. There's these three primary fuel models that you see out there: the Anderson's fuel model, the Scott and Bergen model, and the NFDRS model. It's extremely, this is really the crux of why I was pretty excited to talk to you folks, because I know there's a lot of confusion, and sometimes where we may have taken that S290 or S491 intermediate NFDRS class, where it was a long time ago, and I sometimes fall victim to this myself when people are talking different fuel models, but to differentiate between them and to understand what applications they need to be applied to. So when we're talking fire behavior and we're looking at fire behavior calculations, it's really the Anderson model and the Scott and Bergen. And more typically, we refer to those as the Fuel Model 1s, the Fuel Model 2s. That's the Anderson model, where we have the 13 standard that we've all learned on. And then there's the Scott and Bergen model, which is the 40 fuel types, which is just a more refined, and I'll get into that here in a bit, a more applicable to prescribed fire and things of that nature, a better modeling tool that was developed after Anderson's. And then we jump into the National Fire Danger Rating System model, which has almost exclusively used for planning purposes. There's 20 of those fuel models, first developed in 1978, revised in 1988. There's a 2016 version out there right now, and I'll get into that here in just a bit. But a good take-home message there is a fuel model is a set of fuel bed inputs called fuel types. So those fuel types under each one of those is what we're talking based on the fuel model. So the fuel model, the difference between fire danger ratings and fire behavior predictions, again, fire danger ratings almost applicable solely to the NFDRS model, and the fire behavior prediction models that we use. Since many of the factors, fuels, weather, topography, and terminology spread in intensity that are part of the fire danger rating are very similar to those that affect fire behavior predictions, fire danger and fire behavior are often confused and misused. I just can't stress that enough. We really need to understand the difference between, are we talking fire danger, or are we talking actual fire behavior, what we're seeing, and what we want to plan short term and even maybe a couple weeks out. So the principal difference here is that fire danger is a broad scale assessment, while fire behavior is site specific. Fire danger ratings describe conditions that reflect the potential over a large area, and fire behavior deals with an existing fire in a given time and space, basically expressed as real-time or predicted conditions for ongoing fires. The fire behavior fuel models were originally the 13 in the 4 groups, broken down into grasses, shrubs, timber, and slash, with an additional 40 fuel models that have recently been added, and that's essentially the Scott and Bergen model. So real quickly, talk about the Anderson fuel model. It's super common to find the Anderson model in suppression operations. Used to be utilized in prescribed fire quite a bit, but we're kind of drifting away from that just due to the accuracy that we see in the fine tuning that we can get for the Scott and Bergen models. So the original 13 fuel types were designed to support basically the modeling surface fire spread under peak fire conditions. So again, it was old. It was designed to use unlimited amount of fuel, high temperatures and high winds. They were looking to get that peak fire condition. And the reason for that, it was originally designed to support the on-the-ground firefighter, and they wanted to know worst case scenario. If this was the worst day, what can we experience on that fire front, and what do we need to do with our people? It has a sensitivity to live fuels represented in only 5 of them. So again, you get live and dead fuel moistures that are incorporated into this model, but only 4 of the 5, or models 4 and 5, so only 2 of them. They were designed before crown fire modeling was implemented, so we're really not looking at that crown model. Later on, they did tweak it just a bit to understand that, but again, that crown modeling is really difficult and so far fairly inaccurate. Take-home message here is that this fuel model described here should not be used in the NFDRS or confused with the NFDRS model. Common uses of this, applications of the Anderson fuel model, basically for spot weather forecast requests. You guys might hear folks saying, hey, I'm calling this in for a fuel model 2 or a fuel model 6 or 8. Basically, it's a good line tool. Gives us fine dead fuel moisture calculations. It's the ability to do that through what you see there in the right-hand picture, the Fireline Handbook, as well as the Interagency Response Pocket Guide. Both of these contain inserts that allow us to calculate fine dead fuel moisture and probability of ignition outside the fire perimeter. Tools for the folks on the fire line And it's also the primary for short-term predictions of both suppression operations as well as prescribed fire. Some of the programs that utilize the Anderson fuel model, the Appendix B of the Fireline Handbook, just pointed that out. We use it in the following computer programs: Behave Plus, FlamMap, Farsight, and FS Pro. Behave Plus is almost exclusively utilized for prescribed fire. FlamMap, short-term predictions or short-term fire behavior predictions, as well as Farsight, a little bit longer term, utilized by folks on larger fire incidents to let fire managers know where that fire could possibly be going. Also used in that FS Pro, which does both short and long term. Okay, moving on to the Scott and Bergen fuel model. Also utilized for suppression operations as well as prescribed fire. This is the 40 fuel models that I was talking about. And if you remember, the Anderson model talks about grass, shrub, timber, and slash. Scott and Bergen does the same thing. They just have 40 of them. Basically, if you look over to that right-hand picture or graph, you're going to see, or table, excuse me, GR1 is an example of a grass model 1. GS1 is a grass shrub, so there's your hybrid. And then you move over to a shrub, SH1, and then you can move into a timber understory 1, where we're looking at that understory. And again, ground fuels, we're talking about ground fuels as we're modeling that behavior. Moving into a timber litter as well as a slash model. And basically describing that fuel loading and what fire behavior we can predict out of that. One of the advantages of this was it greatly improved the accuracy of fire behavior predictions outside the severe period. So if you recall, in the Anderson model, we're looking at that worst day. Again, the Scott and Bergen model allowed us to do quite a bit actually, more fine tuning and get a better idea of what we can predict with more inputs. Again, this model, please don't confuse this or let folks use this in the NFDRS model. It's not related. So some of the applications, again, very similar to the Anderson model, but widely used as a go-to model for in prescribed fires, as I alluded to earlier. Crown fire modeling was more successful due to that finer tuned fuel type description and essentially the same programs. Again, Behave Plus, I have that highlighted there because it's one of the go-to programs programmed into Behave Plus that we utilize for fire modeling. As a Burn Boss Type 2, can't tell you how much time I spend with the Scott and Bergen. It's a really good model. So, brief touch on weather stations. The NFDRS modeling program requires a variety of Forest Service, Park Service, state, and BLM weather stations to help assess what weather effects are expected in the fire behavior for all phases of pre-suppression planning, and it plays a huge part in NFDRS. These weather stations are operated seasonally or year-round, green up, freeze up, things of that nature you guys are probably familiar with. All fire weather observations need to be transferred into WIMS, which is the Weather Information Management System. I hope I got that right. We'll find out here in a minute. No later than 2 o'clock each day. That's handled by our interagency dispatch centers who post those observations. As far as the NFDRS part of it, the climatic breakpoints were basically established to provide fire planning-based decision points for appropriate management responses. We use these for daily staffing and adjective ratings. So we end up with climatological breakpoints, and I'll get to those here in a minute, or basically points on the cumulative distribution of one fire in time that weather fire danger index doesn't have any regard to associated fire occurrence. A little complicated there, but basically what we do is we put in these climatological breakpoints to indicate where we're at in a seasonal overlook. The Forest Service is directed to use the 90th and 97th percentile for highest fire. So we'll look on a pocket card here in just a minute, but they use a little bit higher. BLM uses a little bit lower for those climatological breakpoints. I'll get into those here in just a second. So differences between the National Fire Danger Rating System and the fire behavior predictions programs that we use, modeling programs. NFDRS field models are primarily for broad-scale assessment. They're used to set staffing levels for fire season. We use them to pre-position preparedness resources, engines, helicopters, large air tankers across the United States. It's also used to regulate industrial activity. The Forest Service has contracts with loggers in the woods. If NFDRS outputs are telling us that we have increased fire potential, that could greatly impact those vendors that are out there in the woods. They might have to shut down at noon just due to that fire danger. Also utilized to place fire restrictions by federal, state, and local agencies. So when you see those fire dangers of high, moderate, low, those are being regulated or being calculated through the NFDRS system. And I talked on the previous slide about pocket cards. What I've got here up is an example of those pocket cards over a season. You can see it starts in April and ends in October, and how it kind of goes as we know. We're going to see that increase, an uptick in fire, in the core months of summer, July, August, September. And that's that breakpoints that I talked about earlier. Those climatological breakpoints are inserted in there based on the raw station and where historically we've seen large fire activity and where those lay based on those breakpoints. Just to talk about briefly again, the fire danger rating system for the pocket cards is a great, just almost exclusively used as a situational awareness tool by firefighters. I'm sure you guys have seen these throughout. So talking more specifically about NFDRS, I actually found this schematic and thought I would put it up. It's a pretty complicated schematic about how NFDRS works. I don't know if you guys have had the pleasure or torture of sitting through S491 intermediate NFDRS, but what I can recall and what I know and utilize is that one input, that fuel model. Almost exclusively in the West are the G models, and you can see over on the right the other table where the NFDRS fuel models come into play. Under grass, you have A, L, and T. Grass and shrubs, CDRS, and it continues on down there. But for the NFDRS outputs, we almost exclusively use, say for Brian in Nebraska, you're looking at the T model, you're looking at the grass. For the Mountain West, we're looking at that G model, which is your forest model. And so once that's inputted and we have other inputs, we're looking for the outputs of ignition component, spread component, burning index, and energy release component. Each one of these is critical for those fire management decisions that I was talking about earlier. Here's an example of a WIMS output. You guys are probably familiar with what's called the DIDX output that interagency dispatch centers post on their websites. You can see this. I pulled directly off the Rocky Mountain Area Fuels webpage. Rocky Mountain Interagency Dispatch Center's webpage. Basically, it's that Weather Information Management System, WIMS output, and how it affects our staffing and situational awareness. So from a fire manager's focus, we're looking at that energy release component and the burn index. And I've got those circled in the oval over on the right-hand picture. You can see in the ERC, I went ahead and pulled 3 different raw stations that I have control over. And just as an example of where you can see that ERC, it's 38, and what we would do is then take that 38 for the energy release component, and that's a direct input into the, let's see if I can go back a slide or two here. I don't know if you can see that better on the fire danger pocket card, but on the left-hand going up axis, that's where we look at that energy release component and where it is and how it falls, and that's how we rate that for the situational awareness for the crews out on the ground. It also has some other plays into it, but we also look at the burn index, one of the outputs of NFDRS, and how that burn index can impact our planning decisions, which I'll get to here in just a minute. And here it is. So the ERC, the seasonal level decisions, and BI are used for daily level decisions. So when we're talking about energy release component, we're really looking at that seasonal level occurrence or where we're at with that ERC. On the BI, the daily level decisions. And we use those with specific breakpoints for staffing, response, and fire danger rating, et cetera. So when you look under that left-hand example, the preparedness level example, that energy release component is really how much energy is in that group of vegetation that's going to take off. And when we're looking at that 67 plus, this is an example from the Rapid City Ranger District Forest Service up in the Black Hills. They're looking at a pretty heavy-handed idea of where they need to be for preparedness. And again, it relates back to policy. So this is that administrative side of NFDRS, that if they're not staffing based on that ERC, we're neglecting our policy. If you jump over to the right hand of the screen, you can see that this is a response level, a run card, we commonly call them, utilizing that burn index. So you can see that the two differences here. We're looking on the left-hand side for preparedness, we're looking at that seasonal level decision. In the May, June, July, that late spring, early summer, this is the preparedness level that we need to be at. When we're looking at that burn index part or side of NFDRS, we're really looking at how our response level, how are we going to respond to a fire that particular day. So that's used for the daily level decisions. And you can see how, as that BI increases, how that response level is also going to be increased. Also note at the bottom of the page there, the correlation that I've got from the raws producing the adjective. Again, all of these are adjective ratings for the energy release component, the burn index, affecting that staffing level. So understanding NFDRS from an adjective rating for fire danger, it's also a product of NFDRS. It's basically a way, and this is my boss's quote, I love it, it's basically a way of dumbing down the output into a public-friendly message of where we're at a given point in time regarding that day's fire danger. But again, looking back at the WIMS DIDX output, we're essentially looking at where I've got it circled for the R. That's the adjective rating output that comes straight out of NFDRS that gives us a moderate rating for that raw station. Now, I apologize, I forgot to mention, if you look off to the left of that table, you see that there's three different points or three different ratings for Acheta, right? Or three different entries for the Acheta raw station. When you go over to the 13F7G 2P2, that G that you see in the middle there is the actual fuel model that we're utilizing out of that NFDRS output. You go down to the next one, that T there would be the adjective rating if we were utilizing a grass model. As you pop down one more, you see that C, you go back to NFDRS fuel models, that C is that shrub model. So you can see the differences there where you've got it's a 3, so that calculates it as a moderate fire danger. You pop down to that T model, you see a 1 as a low, and if you go into shrub, that 2 is an L, and that's really all driven by that 10-hour fuel moisture stick that's hanging off of that raw station. So what do we use this for? That rating is really what I call Smokey's arm. A lot of these fire danger signs that you see have a Smokey's arm either pointing in extreme, very high, high, moderate, or low. So Smokey's arm that day should be pointing at the adjective rating that's calculated at an NFDRS. And a lot of times you're going to have fire manager reacting saying, my God, we had just a huge fire yesterday and Smokey's arm's pointing at moderate fire behavior. Well, that's because it's the adjective rating. We can't just run out there and move Smokey's arm up to extreme because it's not really being reflected from the raw stations that we have out there. Now, we may not have raw stations in the area that are accurately calculating that. Another good reason where you have folks like me that will run out there and take the live and dead fuel moistures and try and do an external run in some of those other programs to come up with an adjective rating for a more localized snapshot of where we're at. So I hope that's a pretty good wrap up of the three different models and how NFDRS comes into play and how we utilize it. And I'd like to talk real briefly on critical fuel status and how we get there. Super lucky to have the Rocky Mountain Area Fuel Status page hosted by the Rocky Mountain Interagency Dispatch Center and Communication Center, where they allow us to interact with you guys, the meteorologists, to do the inputs for where we sit for critical fuel status. So when we're looking at it, it really should be a combination of looking at the status of measured live and dead fuel moisture. So going all the way back to the beginning, where we've gone out and we've collected those fuel samples and taken a good hard look at where we've collected and what they're telling us. Next, looking at the trending seen in the National Fuels Database. I, as a fire manager, should go back and double check and make sure that we are trending in that right direction towards, increase in fire behavior, which would be an indicator that I need to uptick that critical fuel status. We also need to look at the ERC and BI ratings to make sure they correlate in NFDRS with what we're seeing in the trends in the National Fuels Database, as well as what we're seeing in our live and dead fuel moistures. We look at our fire occurrence. Are we seeing more? Are we getting more frequent fire behaviors? Just as Brian indicated, you've got a couple of fires that have been happening in the Nebraska area. So you're seeing a trend, an increase in that fire occurrence. What kind of fire behavior are we seeing out there? That's back to the fire manager. Are we seeing an increase? Commonly we see where incident commanders will come back and report to us, man, it was burning great in the grass, but as soon as it hit that shrub or timber element, that fire really died down. That's telling us that that shrub and timber component really isn't quite ready yet. That 10-hour, 100-hour, and 1,000-hour fuel model really isn't showing us that it's ready to burn yet, so it's not quite into that critical status yet. Or, and this is typical, where we see the shading in the understory of the timber stands, where we get fairly good fire behavior in that understory of the timber, but as soon as it breaks out into a meadow, that grass component really isn't carrying the fire, so it's actually acting as a barrier to that fire spread. So we need to take these into consideration as well, and understand to go back and measure those fuel moistures, such as grass or what's under the timber layer, and understand how they are either contributing to or acting as a barrier to that fire spread. We look frequently at fire size. Are we getting not only more fires, but are they increasing in size? What's that telling us? We're seeing an increase in fire behavior, and those initial attack resources are not being successful in containing those fires. Also look at the KBDI. As we talked about earlier, that is a great indicator and utilized all over the country to see if there's correlation between what we're seeing and with the drought situation is being reflected in the fuel situation. Ironically, before this presentation, we took a good hard look at what we've been doing with our turning our critical fuel status on and off, and that is an actual zone 297, which is in one of my areas up by Gillette, Wyoming, Rocky Mountain Area Fuel Status Forum. My boss and I took the opportunity to run some Fire Family, actually it's Fire Family Plus, not Fire Family Pro, runs to see if those ERCs and BIs were actually in alignment with when we were turning these on and off. Because a lot of times, a snow event or a seasonal event is when we're looking at turning those things off, and that's really not the right way to be doing business. But fortunately, for the most part, almost everything else was in alignment. I don't know if, determination of critical fuel status, I wouldn't say lies almost exclusively, but lies almost exclusively with the local fire management official. It really should be in that communication with our meteorologists between the fire management officials. But I know you guys get busy. You're busy now, and I appreciate your time today. But and we get busy as well. When we start getting into that fire season, there's a lot of distractions that don't allow us to communicate well. But managers should be basing those decisions on the empirical data derived from fuel moisture status in any particular fire weather zone, utilizing the elements that I just described. An example of that is taking the critical fuel status and correlating the ERC where the fire managers have turned on and off the critical fuels in those fire weather zones they manage, just like we described for that zone 297. There's a lot of complications to that. Fire managers may not be keeping up with their current fuel status. It's absolutely indicative of when you go through the zone history and zone status in the Rocky Mountain page, where some folks still have critical fuels either turned on or turned off, since 2011. That's absolutely an indicator that there's been some turnover in that fire management position, and nobody's worked with those fire weather zones to get those folks back engaged. Seasonal weather may not reflect where conditions should be, and managers have a poor situational awareness of what's actually going on up there. You get that short-term or you've got that isolated drying event that's just not being reflected off of your raws. The only way to fix that is for the fire managers to be out there ground truthing that. Specific weather events change that fuel condition more rapidly. You've got the frequent wetting events that are still absolutely not being captured by the raw stations and reflecting that. Or there could be a great distance in between where folks have got to travel. I'm in Casper, Wyoming. I've got raw stations all the way to the Montana and South Dakota borders, 3 hours away. Not an excuse, but kind of an indicator that, I've got to travel around and see those, and at times I might be distracted and not be able to do that. Anyway, that's kind of a reflection where fire managers control many fire weather zones that are not adjacent. A lot of the fire weather zones that are under my control are pretty scattered and disjointed. So again, it's important for me to get out and make sure that I'm visiting all those. So how can we do better? Strongly feel that communication is the key. When I first got in this job, and I got a chance to meet Kelly Allen. She was the meteorologist at the Riverton weather station, and don't feel like we were on the same page, and got an option. She was gracious enough to invite me over to her shop, and got to meet with some folks and really go into detail about what I, as a fire manager, am looking at and what's important to me and what's not important to me. And I think that helped us get on the same page. And as recently as last year, Chris Jones, now running the weather station over there in Riverton, wasn't getting the response that he needed back from the fire managers. Was able to touch base with each and every one of those folks and develop not only do we have the Rocky Mountain Area Fuel Status page where we can put inputs into. He came up with this Google Doc form, which is a great way to make sure that folks know or have an opportunity to put into, communicate back to the Weather Service of where we feel those critical fuels are and why. So I sure appreciated that of the Riverton folks. Had great success in talking with the Billings zone folks, Dan Borsum and his group. Very receptive, very easy to get along with, and I absolutely appreciate that. Same with the Rapid City folks and the Cheyenne folks that we deal with. Frequently getting calls. I can feel that I guess as we're getting closer to fire season, where folks feel like they just don't have folks pinned down, and I get that vibe a lot, I guess is what I'm trying to say, that they really want to talk to us. And kudos to folks that develop that primary and secondary and even last resort contact that you see on this Google Doc form, for you as the meteorologist to get that input on where we're at for critical status and why. We're going back to that red flag status. Nobody likes to see red flag warning number 82. It affects us all. So I think the better we can build that communication, and I put that onus back on the fire managers, and I have almost no idea how to help you folks there other than to direct you to just keep talking to who you can find, and just, on a slow day, just try to make contact with those folks. I think they'd be pretty receptive and feel honored to participate in having some impact on those red flag warnings, especially when they become endless. So pretty much concludes my presentation, and I appreciate your folks' time. I hope I was able to enlighten some of the direction that fire managers go with this. And I'd like to open up the floor to any kind of questions of folks out there if we can make that work, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that presentation, taking the time out to give us that information, and thanks for that last slide too. Communication is a big deal and something that it takes effort, and it's important effort though. It goes a long way. So at this time, looks like we've got a pretty good crowd still involved here. If anybody has a question for Eric, go ahead and raise your hand, I guess, in the webinar, and I'll go ahead and unmute you. All right, looks like Jeremy Martin out in Goodland, Kansas, should now be unmuted. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Hi, this is actually Ryan Husted, the warning coordination meteorologist in Goodland. I'm also the fire weather focal point here. I had a question for you that's come up recently, and I've been wondering about. We've got a lot of tall, standing, dead grass, and we've had a few snow events. How much of an impact on fire activity does grass that's been packed down by heavy snow, how different is that versus tall, standing grass that hasn't been packed down yet in terms of fire activity?
That's a great question, Ryan. We're basically what you're describing to me is taking that vertical arrangement of that fuel and making it horizontal. And it's one of my pet peeves as a fuels manager when I'm looking at doing altering a fuel environment is where that fuel is just rearranged. It's not removed. It's going to change the characteristics a little bit. It might actually increase depending on you've taken that separation that you had with that vertical standing grass and you've compacted it now onto the ground. So you could see more intense fire behavior or a bigger spread through that than you would see in that vertical arrangement. That's always a big question for us up here too, in regards to those snow events. When all of our live and dead fuel, well, basically at that point, they're essentially cured and we're dealing with dead fuel moistures, and how that contributes when there's those snowbanks out there where we're actually in that environment where fuels could be critical, but really they're not going to contribute to large fire growth. But what I'm hearing you say is that your question revolves around that arrangement, and I'd say it's just as hazardous as what you would experience with standing. It's also a much more receptive fuel bed when you've got that compacted horizontal fuel model now, where it's all laid down. It's going to be super receptive to any kind of embers that are falling ahead of that fire or the flaming front. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that does, and thank you for taking the time to answer. We had the opposite suspicion that due to the fuels laying down and not as much oxygen, I guess, within the fuel, we were thinking it wouldn't burn as bad. So that's good to know, and thank you for clearing that up.
Absolutely.
Great question. Any other questions out there? Go ahead and raise your hand, and I can unmute you. Otherwise, I'll throw one out there. I mean, just for you personally, Eric, or others in your similar position, I mean, what sort of weather information do you find most beneficial out of the Weather Service? Is it the standard provision, or is it on those any certain elements, or on the high impact days, or can I even break it out a little farther? Do you find a lot of benefit in the long-term outlooks? You know, the 10-day or the 30-day outlooks. Anything you can elaborate in on that, and what's especially beneficial to you?
Well, that's a good question, Brian. There's a couple things in there. We'll start with the last one. Those 30-day outlooks, we do appreciate, because it kind of gives us an idea of whether we should, it helps us prepare mentally as well as, administratively for what we're getting into. But we also take it with a grain of salt. It's kind of like asking me, what kind of fire season do we think we're going to have? I can go back to these items and give you a good assessment, and I've been proven wrong almost every time. So, we almost never know, and most fire managers that are worth their salt will tell you, I'll tell you what kind of fire season we're going to have after the fire season. So I guess I'm trying to pitch that back to how I view where you guys are at, that 30-day outlook. You're just using modeling programs, same as we are for those fire behaviors predictions. They're good to know. I appreciate those, and I have yet to meet a fire manager that isn't looking at those fire weather briefings that you guys produce and are rebroadcast through the Rocky Mountain area webcast. Products that we use, that's a good question. Wish I could get back into my website and I could show you what I've got flagged, but surface observation, there's a product, and the only way I can find it is utilizing the, basically I Google surface observations for Missoula in Google, and then this ROS map pops up. When I look at that ROS map, that geographical layout for those RAWS maps really allow us to look at precipitation events and how they progress by checking the individual RAWS stations, not just RAWS stations, but all weather stations. Huge product. A lot of us are all trying to read the tea leaves on where lightning events are coming through. When we've got those summer events where that storm front is moving across, where is it dumping that rain? And then we look at the lightning map and determine, well, this was a dry event through here, wet up there. We can really fine tune where we're going. There is it's difficult to describe, but if I was to just generally go into go to your Riverton National Weather Service, for example, and I click on Casper and I get the 7-day forecast. On the right-hand side, I can go down and I can look at a more detailed forecast over that 7-day period. Is extremely valuable, and actual empirical documentation that I put into my burn plan showing that this is what was predicted over the next 7 days when I go to light that fire. Because as an RXB2, you're really hanging your hat out there based on all the evidence that you have. So lots of folks that I interact with utilize that program quite frequently, as well as what I don't know if it's universal, but what Riverton National Weather Service has developed for that short-term planning. Hope that answers your question, Brian.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, it's just always great to get insight from other entities, just to see what's being used out there. So I appreciate that. Last call for any questions out there. Watching for any hands raised. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, on that note, thank you to everyone who chimed in, and thank you very much, Eric, for taking the time and sharing that information with us. Like I said, it's just great to have people from outside the National Weather Service provide that subject matter expertise you all have in it. I really appreciate it. For those on the call, we'll be rolling into our next in this series probably in 2 to 3 months. So stay tuned for more information on that, and hopefully you enjoyed the call today. Eric, thanks again, and everyone have a great day.
Yeah, it was an honor. Thank you, Brian, and everybody else. Appreciate it.